All right, let's get class started. I've heard that the A students work for the C students or something. Let's take a look at how to short circuit this process by discussing how we can better communicate our design work. Get a load of this guy. Who is he? Rhodey? Gearhead? How about her over there? Some kind of graphic designer? An artist, maybe? You know what? They're actually both doctors. First impressions matter. First impression matter a lot. In fact, what you do in the first few seconds of meeting someone will color their impressions and opinions of you for the rest of that interaction and for a long time following. Shakespeare had it right in Hamlet. The apparel oft proclaims the man. Case in point. Let's take a look at what we can do to address this. The first question you want to ask yourself is, what image do you want to project? And you've got a lot of options out there. We can sit anywhere we like along this scale of formality, all the way from ultra casual to ultra formal. But really, there is a right answer somewhere in the middle of this scale. How do we know where we should be on this scale? One of the key questions here is, how do you present yourself as someone your audience wants to listen to? And this applies everywhere, not just with presentations, with interviews, networking events, obviously, but also fundraisers, conferences, even meeting your significant other's parents for the first time. Let's take a look at some of the most common options that we utilize in the field of engineering. So first up is smart casual, which is typically about where I am on an ordinary day, unlike today. Now, you can either hit or miss with your clothing choices. The goal with smart casual is to appear familiar and relatable. However, if you're underdressed, you might appear amateurish or lazy or sloppy. So we can step it up a little. Business casual, the goal here is to project capable, knowledge, and professional, right? However, you can appear bland or boring if you're overdressed, or in a lot of cases, you can still be underdressed. So you can step that up one more time to business formal. You want to project power and expertise. But if you're overdressed, you can appear intimidating or out of place. So, how do we calibrate this to our audience? We're going to dig into that in just a moment. For now, there are links above me that'll go into more detail about how to create these aesthetics and how to select clothes to make it work for you. So why do I dress casual or smart casual for class? Usually I don't go fully casual like I just was. And that's because I don't want to make it look like I don't care, because I do care. I love teaching, and I love teaching all of you. And I've really enjoyed this semester overall, despite the wild nature of this thing. So the answer really is to appear more relatable. That's important to me. And that's important, especially as a 6'2", 250-pound, straight white, overeducated male living in the United States, right? I like to cut myself down to size to be more relatable to all of you. Now, this isn't necessarily the same for my female colleagues or my international colleagues. They're going to typically dress a little more formally than I do. And part of that is because it's more important for them to command respect and demonstrate their expertise through the way they present themselves. And of course, the second most popular option, to encourage discourse, curiosity, and feedback, that's absolutely it. If I intimidate you, it's very difficult for you to contribute in class and feel like you can take chances and make guesses and try new things with your design projects. And that's not the type of environment I want to create. And so I'm not going to give you specific style tips other than to acknowledge that there is a range of formality. And here are three of the most common types of dress that engineers utilize in the workplace today, at least in the United States. Obviously, this varies place to place, country to country, but this is what you're going to see. And most often, you're going to see something like smart casual or business casual. But really, a big part of this question here is knowing your audience, right? So, this is step one along this process of selecting your outfit is how does your audience dress? Because your starting point should probably be something very similar to the way your audience dresses, which is why I tend to dress down for class. But you won't see me dressing down at a conference like that. I'm going to dress up because I want to command more respect. I'm not a well established scientist. So I need to command more respect. So the starting point is the way your audience dresses, and you're going to shift more formal if you want to command more respect, demand more attention, and you're going to shift more informal if you want to be more relatable, more familiar. And so that's where you want to be is there plus or minus one. The next question is how old is your audience, right? Because standards of dress have changed over time and we become less formal over time. Even over my career, we become much less formal. And so that's a key question, right? If your audience is above 50, then you might shift a little more formal. Some other important questions to ask about your audience is, do they belong to a particular culture or subculture? Can you connect to that culture? For example, the Penn State polo that I'm wearing right now. That's, I'd like to demonstrate that I am a representative and a teacher here at Penn State because I'm very proud of that. And you should all be proud of that too. This is a heck of a school. What is their educational or professional background, right? So that's going to change the way you communicate and how you communicate with them. How much jargon can you use, right? What kind of jargon can you use? If you're talking to architects, there's a lot of design language that they're going to engage with aggressively, but maybe some of the technical language they're going to struggle with. Similarly, with engineers, they're looking for that technical content and they're going to be less interested in the pure design content with respect to your design projects. And finally, what information do they need or want from you? And this is important here, right? Considering what information they really are looking for before you start developing your presentation is crucial. A great example is my thesis research. So it's fairly interesting research. A lot of different groups have asked me to give a talk on my research, and that's been great. But what I have now is several different versions of that presentation. So I have one for specifically lighting designers and one for color scientists, and then an entirely separate one for lay people that changes the intensity of the information, the depth of information, and the amount of jargon I'm using and not explaining. And finally, long-term or short-term relationship, right? Are you presenting this to an audience of people that you'll never see again? Or are you presenting this to your work colleagues? That's going to change the way you develop this presentation. So for a short-term relationship, you probably just want to be efficient and effective and get straight to the point. Whereas for a long-term relationship with your audience, you want to take some extra steps, maybe take some extra time to build familiarity and rapport with your audience instead of just jumping straight to the point. Another thing to think about with long-term relationships is exercising more caution with criticism and negativity, right? Because that can color that relationship moving forward. Another common thing that you're going to run into all the time is an audience of one. And in fact, that's basically what you're doing with your design presentations. You're just delivering them to me. So you have an audience of one. So now you can dig a little deeper and ask questions about that specific person, right? What is their relationship to you or your project, right? So that's going to set expectations and create assumptions about what kind of information content you're delivering, right? Is there a power dynamic there? Do you owe them, or do you owe them respect, or do they demand respect? Either one. Um, Also, that's going to better define their wants and needs, right? Is this a manager that you're presenting this information to primarily so they can make actionable decisions? Or is this more of an architect that wants to understand the depth and detail of what you've designed? How much time do they have? And this one is crucial. You do want to respect people's time. You want to respect everyone's time because time is one of our most valuable resources. That said, time is even more important to respect when there's a power dynamic at play. Here's some other questions I like to consider going into a presentation. What are my audiences? What is that person's personal interests, goals, and desires? What are they working on? How does your work connect to theirs, right? What do they do out of the office? How can you make this interesting to them and directly relatable to their lives? This is something I ask myself all the time when I'm building these kind of presentations is how can I connect arcane things like lighting controls back to something you experience every day? And so I've developed that particular lecture. Last year, when I delivered it, I spent a lot of time in the weeds talking about architectural systems that, frankly, the students really didn't care about. And I don't blame them because, for the most part, none of them would ever interact with a system like the ones I was describing. So this year, I pared down that lecture and focused in more on the types of controls that you see and experience in your everyday life so that you could take some of that information and directly apply that to things that you already do. You know, lighting systems at home, for example. Oh, speaking is a crucial one. So how fast does that person speak? And what is their typical pause length? A great example, Says up there at the top. Says is one of the few people that has a more intense vocal pattern than I do. I love meeting with Says, and also I never ever go into meetings with Says unprepared. That would be a terrible mistake because otherwise you're along for the ride. On the extreme other end of the spectrum, I have real difficulty communicating with my father-in-law. My mother-in-law jokes that he talks like an Ent. You know, the tree folk from Lord of the Rings. He really does talk at about this speed. My pause length is shorter than the pauses between his words. So it's important, if I want to respect him and communicate effectively with him, that I slow my speech patterns down and try to meet him more in the middle so that we can have a better conversation. Otherwise, I'm overwhelming, I'm intense, I'm exhausting, and he doesn't want to deal with me. I mean, he probably doesn't want to deal with me either way, but that's beside the point. If I don't make an effort, then it's really going to drive that home hard. Another way to think about people's personalities is the big five personality traits. Now, I'm not talking about, personality tests where the first question is they ask you what month you were born in. Big five personality is actually pretty well supported by psychological research. But really more importantly here is it provides you a good framework for thinking about other people and the way they interact with the world around them. right? So the big five personality traits all exist on these scales. And so those scales are uh, closed mindedness versus open mindedness, organization, introversion versus extroversion, agreeableness, and intensity. So when you're talking about a particularly open person, for example, is you can ask, do they want their expectations to be carefully met? Do they want to be challenged or surprised, right? So people that are open to new experiences like those challenges and surprises, like new ideas and new information, whereas people that are a little more closed-minded can feel overwhelmed or intimidated by new ideas, and it's better to relate to them on a more familiar level. Conscientiousness is a similar kind of thing. How much can you rely on them to follow through on what you decide together in your meeting? And also, what expectations will they have for you coming out of the meeting? Extroversion is an interesting one. And one of the big questions here is how private or how open are they about themselves, right? Because for extroverts like myself, asking me questions about my personal life is a pure positive, right? That's enjoyable to me. However, there are a lot of people that are more introverted. They're more private about their personal life and their personal details, and it can feel like prying when you ask too many personal questions. And so another way to think of this is, are new people enjoyable or are they stressful? And what can you do to engage with their enjoyment of new people or mitigate the stress they feel having to meet and deal with an entirely new person? Agreeableness. So the big one here is, how should you interpret feedback and criticism from them? Right? If they're a very agreeable person, my wife Katie, she is one of the most lovely, kind people on the planet, and she will say something positive about you no matter how much she thinks you're an absolute idiot. And that's important to keep in mind sometimes, because it can sound like she's agreeing with me when she clearly thinks the idea is terrible. So don't mistake friendliness for assuming that you're right about something. And similarly, with disagreeable people, don't assume that criticism is an attack on you personally. In fact, really don't assume criticism is an attack on you personally. It rarely is. And I would argue that being able to engage in a healthy way with criticism is an absolute virtue of a personality trait, and something I've worked very hard to develop myself. And finally, neuroticism, right? How relaxed or high strung they are is going to flavor how they take bad news and good news, right? Do they take bad news really hard? Do they not want to hear about delays and setbacks? Maybe with that, you want to sandwich bad news inside of some more positive news and focus on the way to move forward instead of focusing on the bad news. Whereas if someone is pretty laid back, maybe they just want to be told straight how it is so they can address it and not be blindsided by the problems in your project. So let's apply this specifically to me, because this is going to be helpful for your presentations coming up during finals week. So I'm going to open some polls here. So I've got two rounds of this because I ran out of questions. So apparently you can only do 10 questions per poll. Anyways, these are, so you're answering all of these questions with respect to me, right? So we're going through the questions and the personality traits that I just presented. Now, remember here, the point of this is not to be correct. The point of this is to give yourself a framework for thinking about other people and how they relate to the world. We're not trying to profile me and stick me in some kind of prejudice bin. That's not the goal. The goal here is to think critically about other people and what their wants and needs are, and how you can deliver that in the most effective way. First up is your opening. And this is absolutely crucial. In fact, both your opening and your closing are some of the most important elements of any presentation. In fact, this is the same way I think about it. So, tying this back to my background as a DJ, I spend more time thinking about my first and last song in a set than I do about the entire rest of the set, because I recognize that what people will take away is their first impression, and your opening is your second chance at a first impression. And your closing, because that's the last thing they experience of you as the presentation ends. So, opening and closing are crucial aspects of the way we set up our presentations. The two big things that you want to deliver effectively in your opening: number one is your thesis statement. You want it to be clear, concise, and comprehensible to everyone. What are you presenting? Why? Give me a reason to listen to more, because that's your first chance to really grab my attention and pull me in to the presentation. And second off, bold imagery. Open up with one of your best renders or a nice logo, or something that is really demonstrative of what you're trying to deliver in that presentation, because this is the other aspect of immediately engaging your audience. Grab something that's beautiful, something that's interesting or surprising, right? Or something that gives a lot of information and insight into the content of the presentation. And here are some of my favorite examples of that from AE 311 and my presentation for my doctoral defense. So this gives you a lot of information. In some cases, like in the case of my doctoral defense, these are the visual targets I used throughout the studies. So this establishes early what we were illuminating, right? And the range of options and the range of things that our participants evaluated. So this gives you a ton of information about the contents of the presentation. Whereas up here, I used images that were bold, colorful, and interesting, because I wanted to engage in a way that didn't necessarily try to assume that you knew very much about the content inside, because that's what you're here to do, is learn. So this is more of an establishing shot of something that's rich and colorful, so that it can draw you in and make you want to learn more about how we can design for human vision, for example. Scope. Scope is crucial, especially when you're communicating something fairly complicated. And when you're communicating design, you are by definition communicating fairly complicated concepts. So it's important to set up your scope effectively and early, right? How do we get there, and what path are we going to take? And so I like to think of this in terms of systems of information. And setting this scope is about setting a shared agenda or plan for the presentation, and providing clarity on your purpose and your direction. And then the question becomes after that is, how are you building the system of information, right? You know what the whole looks like because you spent a lot of time working on developing the whole, but your audience doesn't necessarily. So how do you build those pieces up, connect them to make a complete picture? So let's take a look at a couple examples here. And these are examples from my lectures. So, this is just titles, right? Titles of the sections, and showing you the scope of all the design phases, and then the scope of what we actually discussed in class. So it's useful. It does contain the information in the way that I was just describing, but this is pretty bland. This is just fulfilling the basic requirements. So let's step this up a bit. We can add a basically section titles here. And so then you can see quickly within these section titles where we're at, switches in this case, and where we're going to next. But my absolute favorite way to do this, and this can take some extra time to develop, but it's well worth it if you really care about the presentation, is building a graphical roadmap, right? So showing you where you're going. In your case, that's going to be the plan view of your building for your design projects, right? That's your roadmap. Those are all the places that we're going to. And then within that, you can focus on different elements. Here's a great example from my vision and perception lecture. My roadmap was the eye, and we talked about vision in context of the various structures of the eye, so that when we got to the retina, what I did was take that roadmap and remove pieces we weren't talking about so we could focus in on the elements relevant to the topic we were actively discussing. So graphic roadmaps can be extremely effective because it not only shows you where you are, it also connects you to where you've been and where you're going. The visual field. The visual field on a slide is very important to consider, right? We don't want to overlook the way we construct our slides. In almost all cases, images are strictly superior to words. Images are strictly superior to words. A photo can tell 1,000 words, but there's only so many words you can put on a slide before it becomes overwhelming and people just simply stop reading it. You want to be careful not to flood the visual field with too much content or too tightly spaced content, right? Clearly separate your elements, use the space you have, but still clearly separate your elements. Another technique I love to use, and I'm going to show you an example of my favorite application of this in just a moment, is sequential presentation. Instead of starting with the everything, you can build up pieces, and that's how you can help build that system of information. And finally, it's key for your wording to be concise. How could we improve that? And if I can deliver the exact same content or concept with 2 words instead of 5 words, instead of 9 words, yes, I will. I will always try to cut down words. And when I'm building a slide, I usually write it out in more natural language, right? And then I come back and ruthlessly cut that down, right? I'm reminded of this. There's this style guide that I really like. It's the Elements of Style by E.B. White. This is the guy that wrote Winnie the Pooh. In this, he devotes like an entire page to how much he hates the word very, an empty and meaningless adjective, either removed or replaced with something with actual content. And his hatred of the word very, I feel, is quite justified. What is very doing that a better crafted sentence can't already do on its own? So consider how you can cut down your wording to the bare minimum to get your idea across. So let's take a look at sequential presentation, because I feel like that is one of the most effective and most straightforward techniques to reduce the information intensity when you really don't have any other choice, because complex concepts are complex. But we can build up the pieces because extra slides are free, right? So this is my explanation of why we do logarithmic dimming versus linear dimming, right? And I start with just the linear dimming curve, and then I show what that looks like on a perceptual basis in comparison to the levels on the dimming controller. And so then I add to this why we need to compensate for this, and that's because our perception is logarithmic, right? So there's our perceptual curve. And so then we provide the exact same thing right here on the other side of that dimmer to show that if we use a logarithmic dimming curve, we get a more linear perception of dimming. And so this is a really complex concept with a lot of moving parts. And yet by building it up, it doesn't seem nearly as overwhelming as if I just drop this whole slide in at once. We can also think about unified formatting. And I highly recommend utilizing unified formatting throughout your presentations because it makes it easier to find information quickly. So repetition and hierarchy are crucial elements of unifying your formatting and making it easier to find information quickly. And that means you will get more across of what you want, of what you care about, because your audience won't be spending nearly as much time just trying to figure out where you are and what the information they need is. It's also helpful in comparison slides because you can quickly demonstrate differences just by overlaying the differences on back-to-back slides. I highly recommend maintaining your font, your text size, your bulleting, even the placement of your text boxes. For example, the one above me or the section guide to my right here. Maintain those positions unless you have a very good reason not to. Again, it's about simplifying that information gathering procedure for your audience. Having a hierarchy is crucial too. This relates directly to building systems of knowledge, right? How do you emphasize important information while still including the less important but still relevant aspects? How do you categorize information of similar importance, right? Establishing a hierarchy in font size and bulleting is a great way to go about that. White space is something I see misused all the time. I like the way I utilize the white space here because I utilize the white space to clearly grid out and separate the distinct elements that I was trying to discuss. However, you'll notice that overall, even though I do use white space in that grid fashion, there's very little wasted space overall. And that's one of my biggest pet peeves. When I see someone present a beautiful render and it takes up like 1/4 of the slide, I could have seen so much more if you'd have just made it larger for me, right? So don't underutilize your white space, but don't cram everything together. There is a nice balance somewhere in between. But I do try to avoid having large expanses of blank space because it just feels wasteful that way. Getting your alignment right. This is related back to hierarchy again, but aligning your elements, especially your text elements, because that's easy to do. So there's no excuse for not getting your text alignment right, but also getting your alignment right on plots like this. So notice here that my alignment on the bottoms of the graphs are just so. And I actually played with that quite a bit to get that to look just right, because that helps reduce the visual noise, reduce the information intensity, even though it's essentially the same. Same thing with this line over here. I align that side, but I think the most important part, and this is a subtle thing that most people don't notice, but each of these points on this plot over here are aligned directly with the dimmer over here so that you can quickly assess where that level is on the plot to my right. And it really highlights the mismatch on the plot over here because it demonstrates how much of a difference there is between what you think you're setting the dimmer to and what you're perceiving in the light source. So alignment can really help with finding information as well. And finally, high contrast, right? This is why uh, I tend to shy away from chromatic backgrounds, because that's going to reduce the contrast of all these images and make them much harder to read and understand. And also keep in mind that while for your presentations being delivered on Zoom, I'll be able to view them on a really high quality computer screen. That's not always true. Oftentimes, you're doing this on a projector, and projectors necessarily have worse contrast than your computer. So, what you see on your computer will be degraded once it's projected onto a wall. And talk about engaging your audience. So, a big part of the way you deliver your presentation comes back to the core concept of engagement. And this is something I preach to the other professors in the AE department, because I think engagement is the cornerstone of education. If you're not engaged with my presentation, you're not learning from my presentation. How do we do this? There's a lot of simple things we can do with ourselves to help drive this. So when we're talking about the image we're projecting, I try to start with a confident posture, right? Because a good posture makes me feel more confident, and therefore I'm able to immediately deliver with more energy and enthusiasm. And this is true even if you don't feel confident, right? A big part of this is fake it till you make it, right? Don't let your audience know that you aren't confident in your material, no matter how you feel about it. And practice makes perfect. Don't forget that. If you really care about your presentation or any presentation, practice it ahead of time, because that will improve your confidence dramatically. And it'll also clean up your delivery dramatically. So you'll spend less time with connections and talking about things that are less important to what you're trying to say, and more time focusing on the crucial elements of your presentation. Energy is so important, right? You be enthusiastic about your topic, right? If I don't believe you care, why should I care? Why should anyone care, right? So again, even if you don't feel enthusiastic about what you've done, fake it till you make it, because you need to engage your audience no matter how you're feeling today or how you feel about your project. Because if you don't deliver with energy and enthusiasm, then your audience will respond with no energy and no enthusiasm. And of course, using an active voice is actually pretty important, right? So by active voice, I mean the active versus the passive voice. And so when I deliver with the active voice, I'm talking directly, I'm making declarative statements, and I'm avoiding too many conditionals. It's not that there aren't conditional elements to the things that I'm saying, and I do point those aspects out. However, you want to deliver your content with an active voice because it gives you more authority, right? So a bad approach is, we wanted to design it this way. And you can say the same thing in this way. We designed it this way because, right? It's sending you to the same place, but the path you take to get there is very different. It makes you more believable and more authoritative when you use an active voice. How do you engage your audience, right? The first aspect is focusing on how to deliver on their wants and needs. And a big way to do that is by building an inventory of your audience, considering who they are, what they're interested in, what their backgrounds are. And that'll allow you to relate your content to them personally, either on a professional level or on a personal level. Either way, you want to meet them where they're at and not try to force them to come and figure out where you are. There's a lot of ways you can make yourself more relatable. The way you dress is important, obviously. You can also take steps to make your content more real and salient by connecting it to real world situations or by including personal anecdotes that make it more human, right? So that's a question I always try to ask myself. How can I tie this content to your everyday life? And we cannot forget about the length of our presentations, right? So this presentation is a great example. This is roughly an hour-long lecture. And so knowing that this is a long format lecture, I do a lot of mode switching. That's why I include a lot of polling. And in person, I include a lot of clicker questions. And that's primarily to engage you in a variety of different ways so that I can meet different people where they're at, right? Not everyone likes every form of engagement, and that's okay. But switching between a variety of modes helps keep your presentation fresh and interesting and helps give people different ways to tie into your presentation. Now, if I was doing just a 15-minute presentation, I wouldn't utilize any of that, right? I would stay very focused, concise, and to the point because I need to deliver the content effectively, right? So this is a great way to think about your presentations. They're reasonably short, so you need to stay fairly focused. However, let's say you practice your presentation and you've delivered all the content effectively and satisfactorily, and you still have 2 minutes left. Maybe consider adding some kind of dynamic engagement to your presentation. And the best way to do that is obviously with humor. Now, humor is a double-edged sword. And I use Jon Stewart for a couple reasons for this. First off, because he's one of my absolute personal heroes and someone I really look up to. But also, he is an incredibly effective presenter and obviously a master of humor. But even for him, there's plenty of jokes that have fallen flat. Every comedian and every presenter, every public performer of any kind has a story of when their performances fell absolutely flat. And that has happened to me as well. That said, it doesn't mean you should be afraid of humor. It means you should plan out your opportunities, right? Don't go into this blind. Off the cuff humor is great for in-person interactions, but during a presentation, you should probably plan that in a little more detail. And here's the trick. What I do is I plan the moments and then I vibe check before I commit, right? Is my audience engaged? Are they ready for this? Right? Especially when you're talking about more racy humor. If your audience is not along with you for the ride, then maybe you just drop that and keep moving. Which brings me, of course, to the topic of language. And there are a lot of things to say on language, but I would like to introduce a couple basic things quickly. So first off, your use of jargon is crucial, and this is all about knowing your audience. Jargon can project expertise and competence. However, if you overwhelm people with jargon that are not familiar with the terms and you don't explain those terms, you're wasting their time and you're confusing them. And that's going to make your presentation substantially less effective, especially if there's no time for questions afterwards. So always consider your audience's an educational and professional background when you're considering how you apply jargon, right? And another aspect of it is providing clear context to your jargon to help clarify what you mean by those words. Slang can be great because it builds familiarity with your audience. Again, this is a double-edged sword. It totally depends on context here, right? Are you in a position of power? In that case, slang can be great to cut you down to size. And so that's why I make extensive use of slang and profanity in class, because it does build familiarity. It helps with the humor, and it helps me emphasize points that I think are particularly important. That said, slang and profanity is very much a double-edged sword. And I would never use slang and profanity if I was talking about my research at a technical conference, because that's not a place I'm in a position of power in, right? So consider your relationship to your audience when you're considering your humor, especially when it includes slang and profanity. And you really want to strictly limit your use of both slang, but especially profanity, um, because that is definitely not rated for general audiences. And unless you are pretty clear on who you're delivering to, you can get yourself in trouble quickly that way. So this does bring me to the conclusion of communicating design. I hope that I was able to introduce some new ideas to you and give you some things to think about and help make your presentations a little bit more human. I recognize that we're all engineers, but that doesn't mean that we can't meet our audience where they're at and engage them in robust ways. So, if nothing else, consider your audience when you're building your presentations. Thank you, everyone.